Hi there, Econ students. This is AP Economics for international students. In this video, we're going to look at a FRQ, free response question from 2015 AP, FRQ number 3. This is a question that features concepts like producer and consumer surplus, price floors, price ceilings, those are price controls, deadweight loss, and elasticity. These concepts, you're going to see them also in A-level and IB, and if you're taking an introductory course at university, you'll also encounter these concepts. So the focus here, this is a second language learner video, so we're going to focus on the vocabulary and how this vocabulary, how these words, this terminology, this jargon is used in microeconomics. So if you're an international student with your mother tongue is not English, then this might be helpful. Often we learn this vocabulary from general usage. Like most of the words you'll see on this page here are words that are familiar from daily life. Most of it, not all. However, you'll notice in this question, and indeed in any other economics question, the words often have quite different meanings. They're fundamentally different because they're related to their usage in this discipline, in this subject. So let's have a look at what we've got here. We'll take this in steps. We'll look at the vocabulary briefly first, and then we'll solve the question. All right, so at the top of the page, you can see here we've got the word widgets. This is the market for widgets. Widgets just means small things for which we no longer remember what they're called. You might also know words like gizmo, gadget, thing, or thingy. They're non-specific devices that we forget the name of. Again, if you're a foreign student, if you're an international student, you've probably taken TOEFL or IELTS or ACT or SAT or all of the above, in which case you know that you don't have to know all these words to answer questions. You just need to focus on the necessary components of the question. So let's look at this next part. It says the government is considering intervening. So intervene means to get involved in, to possibly to interfere, although that's a little bit more negative. So intervention, you might see also that's the noun form. So what are they going to do? They're going to introduce a price control. So here our price controls are the price floor and price ceiling. Okay, we'll look at those in a second. Okay, so the next part, it says calculate the total producer surplus. So you probably remember from your course or from your reading that a producer surplus is the difference between the cost of production as shown on the supply curve and the actual price that is received, which is here at the beginning of this question, it is $20. So it's that area of the triangle. Equilibrium, you certainly would know by now, is the balance point, the point at which supply and demand intersect. Equilibrium, you can see the word equal in there. So often when you're looking at unfamiliar words, try to break it down into its parts. So equal, you probably remember that. Equilibrium, well, something to do with being equal. B, government imposes. Impose means to put in place. Okay, to create, to do, to make, I guess, if you want to be really simple. A price floor. So price floor is a floor that acts as a limit to how far the price can fall. Okay. If it is above the equilibrium, we call it binding, B-I-N-D-I-N-G, or effective. That means it has an effect. If it's below, it doesn't have an effect. So at that point, is there a shortage or a surplus, or neither? Okay. A shortage is when you have quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. Okay, and if you can remember that, then surplus is just the opposite. Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. The government imposes a price ceiling. So again, a good trick here for economics is learn one of the scenarios, the situations, and the other is likely to be the opposite. So price floor, well, what's the opposite? Well, a price ceiling. A floor stops you from falling, a ceiling stops you from rising, just like in real life, I guess. So the price ceiling, if it's below The equilibrium price, we say that it's binding and it's affected. If it's not, then we can just ignore it. Okay, D, government restricts the market output. Restrict means to limit, to constrain. So you can't produce more than this output. So output here means quantity or amount produced, production, 10 units. Okay, calculate deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is what we're losing when we have this restriction. So we're only producing 10 units. That's how much trade, that's how much economic activity is happening. So that means we're losing, lost, right? That's the noun. Lose is the verb. The deadweight loss is the difference, what we would have traded or produced and consumed without that limit, that restriction. So 20 minus 10 there. So it's going to be the area of that triangle. We'll look at that in a second. The last part of the question is about price elasticity of demand. Okay, so price elasticity of demand is one of the kinds of elasticity we study in micro, and it is basically the response to changes in price. So if we look at the percentage change in the quantity demanded, how much does that change in relation to the percentage change in price? Okay, so it's a pretty simple concept, and it actually relates to real life. It's basically how responsive are we to changes in price. And we've got several examples here. Perfectly elastic, so that's a horizontal demand curve. Relatively elastic, so that's going to be greater than 1 if the value is greater than 1. Unit elastic, so that is exactly 1. Relatively inelastic, so less than 1. And then perfectly inelastic, that's going to be vertical. Okay, so you can probably guess that a couple of those, just looking at this demand curve, must be wrong. And you can eliminate them right away. All right, so we're going to now go and look at the questions themselves and see how this vocabulary is used in this question. So let's take a look at the first part of the question here. It asks us about the producer surplus. So we now know that producer surplus is the difference between the cost of production on the supply curve and the equilibrium price here. So that producer surplus is the area of this triangle, which is base times height times 1/2. So $20 is the price on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we've got quantity. It's 20 units. And that gives us $200. So now let's look at question B. So the government imposes a price floor at $16. Is there a shortage, a surplus, or neither? Explain. All right, so I've drawn a line here at $16. Now, what do you notice? You probably notice that the equilibrium price in the market is actually higher than that. And remember, a price floor prevents the price from falling, okay? But if the equilibrium price is already above this price floor, we can say that it's not binding, okay? So that's what your answer would be for the explanation here. You would say that the price floor is not binding. And remember, binding means effective. Okay, so in this case, we've implemented or imposed a price floor, but it doesn't have any effect. It's not binding. So let's move on to the next question. So looking at question C, we can see now we've got the opposite, a price ceiling. So I've drawn a green line here at $12. And you can see now, remember, a price ceiling prevents the price from rising to the equilibrium price. And our price ceiling is indeed below the equilibrium price, which tells us that it is binding or effective. So that would be an adequate answer. Or you could even say that the quantity demanded, I highlighted here, it's about 24, is greater than the quantity supplied, which looks like it's about 12 units there. So you could either just say the price ceiling is binding, that would be fine. Or you could say something like the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Okay, so you have a shortage. Okay. Moving on to part D. We are restricting the market output to 10 units. So let's find that quantity. I've circled it in red, and there's a red line that indicates the distance between these supply and demand curves. So this is the point at which production and consumption stop. So people are only going to be producing and consuming up to that point. So that means that what is lost, the loss in deadweight lost, is the difference between these 10 units here and these 20 units here. Okay, so that's going to give us, again, it's the area of a triangle. So it's half base times height. The base is 20 minus 10, that's 10 units. I've already written it over here. And the vertical distance on the y-axis is $40 minus $10, that's $30. So the area here is the value of this deadweight loss, if we limit to 10 units, is $150. Okay, and remember what that means, dead weight loss. It means that it is what we're giving up here, what we're losing out on because these trades are not occurring. Okay, so you might see this in a tax question, or in this case, they've simply given us a limit of 10 units. So now let's look at the last part of this question. It asks us about the price elasticity of demand when the price changes from $20 to $12. So I've highlighted in green the 2 points. So elasticity of demand is calculated as the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So in this case, we're starting at $20. This is one way to calculate it. There's another method called the midpoint method. It's also called arc elasticity. But this is the simple method, which if the question doesn't ask you to use the midpoint method, you don't have to. And the midpoint method can take a little bit longer, although it's not difficult. The numbers they give you, at least on AP, are always very straightforward, very simple. So in this case, let's use just the standard method. And we're going to use absolute values here. So we're going to ignore negative numbers, okay, for price elasticity of demand. Okay, so it says show your work. So I've written it down already. So 20 minus 24 divided by 20 divided by 20 minus 12 over 20. So we've got the percent change in quantity demanded on the top here and the percent change in price on the bottom. We get 0.2 over 0.4. It gives us 0.5 or 1/2. Now remember, anything less than, so this would be the second part of the question, anything less than 1 is relatively inelastic, okay? Anything greater than 1 would be elastic. So in this case, we could just say something like 0.5 or 1/2 is greater than, sorry, is less than 1. So relatively, when they say relatively, it's just to clarify we're not talking about perfectly elastic or inelastic situations. So a relatively inelastic price elasticity of demand is what we have here. Now, if you want, you could use the midpoint method. To do that, you're going to, you're just going to add in one extra little step here where you're going to divide the top and bottom fractions by the midpoint. So to get that, you just average them out. So 20 plus 24 divided by 2, that's 22. And for that one, you'll get a slightly different number of 0.36. However, it's still less than 1, so it's still relatively inelastic. So to conclude here, we can see that the use of vocabulary in this kind of question is very specific to microeconomics, okay? So you may know some of these words from your other classes, words like elasticity, ceiling, shortage, surplus, floor even. However, they may or may not have a fundamentally different meaning in this context. So if you're learning economics and English is your second language, or third or fourth, make sure you take advantage of the glossary that you should have at the end of your textbook. That will give you the definitions, the meanings of the words as they relate to the topic, to the subject, to the course. Okay? If you just go straight to a regular, even a good English dictionary, the first definitions you're going to have are those that are related to general English, so the most common usages. So things like elasticity, you will get a totally different definition. And certainly if you use a bilingual, a two-language dictionary, you could get into all kinds of interesting trouble with unusual, unrelated definitions. So the best way to learn this vocabulary as you're working your way through your economics course, or indeed any course, is to take advantage of the terminology you find in the glossary, those definitions. Then you won't get into so much trouble with looking at the wrong meanings. So that's it for this episode. I hope it was useful. Make sure that you take notes on this vocabulary and incorporate it into your essays if you're doing A-level, or if you're doing AP, make sure that you add them to your vocabulary list. You should have some kind of a logbook as you work through the course so that you're able to use these words, this vocabulary, in your writing. Not only do you understand them when you see them, but you can effectively use them. That's the key, especially if you want to go on and study these subjects at a higher level at college or tech. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to the next episode.